So good morning, everybody. Jeff Jackson here today, the Forage Fanatic, and I am very, very pleased to have a couple distinguished guests with me. I have Mr. Randy Brown Winfield and Mr. Mark Heineman.
Good morning. Thanks for having us, Jeff. My name is Mark Heineman, a market development agronomist here in Nebraska. I get the privilege and the ability to go out and manage on a different level with my job, but then also I do get to jack around even with some of my operations. So I get to utilize some of the stuff and the learnings that I encourage growers to do in our accounts and apply it on my own operations. So have the ability to have about 50 cow-calf pair. When I get bored with this job, I guess I go out and chase around some cows. Hopefully they're inside my fences. But
That's right.
So what's unique, and I appreciate you having me here this morning, is just being able to apply these practices on my own and get to see it happen firsthand. So being able to utilize cow-calf operation as well as being an agronomist is pretty unique to me, and allows me to learn even more. A lot of growers want to understand if you're out there doing it yourself and if you have money in the game as well. So unfortunately, I got to tell you, I do have money in the game, but the cow industry right now looks pretty promising for a cow-calf guy.
And I'm Randy Brown. I'm an agronomist, Winfield United, and I also get to play around with a ranch and some farm ground. Beth and I, my wife, have a ranch, and we put up some hay, and so I get the practical side. I put my farmer hat on quite often, and so as Mark said, it does help us look at it from two different ways. You get emotionally tied to that checkbook sometimes when you make decisions, and so it's not just all about the science; it's about working through the process of how do I spend my inputs out there.
Yeah, I think that's a neat, unique piece for all three of us, because I have two cow-calf guys on here that understand the importance of high-quality alfalfa, crop management, and the science. And myself, I raise forage crops, multiple crops, alfalfa being one of them, right here in northwest Missouri too. So to your point, Mark, yep, when you make those decisions and you go back and pay for those inputs that we're going to discuss here and the management things that we do, you go, oh, gosh, I hope that was the right call to make. I know plant physiology-wise what I need to do, but sometimes it's hard to make some of those decisions. So I think that's the unique position that the three of us in, is that we are actively participating in agriculture as producers versus just being science guys and a marketing company. So again, we're going to take off here and talk about some hail events in alfalfa. Hope this all hits home for everybody and you can take some useful tidbits out of here too. So here we go. We've had some weather across the U.S. in the last couple of days that have brought some hail events. And so for anybody that doesn't know my background here too, I get to be an alfalfa specialist, and there are some questions coming up, gentlemen, about how do we handle alfalfa after a hail event, and what can we do to help it along now that we have had hail, or maybe did we do something really good ahead of time already that's going to help us out that we didn't even think of in this hail event situation. One of the first things that I wanted to talk about is, let's just say that we are farther north and we have some alfalfa that's maybe in that 4 to 6, maybe up to 8 inch range, and we just had this hail event come through. So again, it's going to be varying degrees of hail, pea-size hail to quarter-sized golf ball-sized hail, very little damage to a lot of damage. From a plant health standpoint, and we don't have to take turns, but let's just go ahead and have an open discussion about what are some of the things that we know through the businesses that we've done across the U.S. that can help that plant recover and be healthier to give us a great first crop alfalfa?
I think the first place I start when I look at any kind of hail damage is obviously what percent of the plant is stripped up. Alfalfa is kind of a unique crop in that, we get the regrowth from the crown. So those come from the buds and the crown. But actually the height and the new leaves all comes from the terminal buds up there. And so I always look at those terminal buds and see if I have any damage. If I don't have damage, that those terminal buds probably going to recover decently with it. Obviously, we never want to see a crop get hail and go through that kind of stress. But if we've had significant damage to those terminal buds, then we got some decisions to make. We got some decisions on what do we do with that damaged tissue? Do we go out? Do we try and hay it? If we're in that 4 to 6, 8 inches or so, we don't have that much out there. If we're 8 to 12 inches, then we got to make some decisions. Are we going to get any regrowth, or should we just take it, then wait for those basal buds to go? There's several things that we can do to help that alfalfa recover. I'll get into that next. Before I turn over to Mark, the other thing I would say is a lot depends on what kind of quality of hay you're going for too. If you're going to go for some quality, we're going to have to make some management decisions. If we're going cow-calf and the quality isn't quite as important to us, we're looking just for some roughage and whatnot. It's a different set of decisions. But I'll turn it over to Mark.
No, I always appreciate your side of the information there, Randy. As we look at a crop like alfalfa and we analyze what to extent the damage was from whether the impact was from large hail or smaller hail also determines that as well. And just assessing the situation is pretty important for us to understand. I've also seen you don't want to see these situations happen, but what's interesting with our jobs is we're able to understand and see these types of effects happen in a widespread out there. But what I've seen is, Jeff, boy, you've done a good job here with some of these newer genetics. They actually do recover a little faster than some of these older genetics in alfalfa now. I mean, we always talk about the fast turn on genetics in corn and soybeans, but boy, I'm telling you, some of these newer alfalfa genetics have recovery in them faster than what we're used to. So I always want to stress out, we talk about the quality of hay as well, but what kind of hay they actually have in there. So if they have a really fast growth type of alfalfa out there, they tend to want to come out faster after stress like this with hail or so forth. And do we have to manage these style genetics differently? And from what I've seen and from what happens, there's some validity behind that to manage these newer style varieties differently than what we have been with some of these olders out there. So does that make sense to maybe, if we're at that 4 to 6 and it didn't look like, we took a lot of damage, it might make sense for us to maybe put something on there to stimulate some growth after this stress out there. So a lot of factors are involved in there, but I tell a lot of people within our crops that we're out there managing, almost doing something's better than nothing. So what's unique about alfalfa too is we're talking about assessing the situation now. But what's good about alfalfa is we're right before first crop cutting here in Nebraska. We got 3 more coming after that. So what we do now can really impact that recovery in our cuttings 2, 3, and 4 out there. If we get the rains here later on, or if we're under a pivot, we can still get some value out of that with this type of crop out there.
So I think there's some points to that too. If you have a fall dormancy 3 variety out there versus a 5, as you mentioned, with how fast they recover, a 5 is going to have a quicker recovery if it gets pounded pretty good and takes a bunch of those stems back. So we have to rely on the buds to take over and get regrowth out there. And I think one of the things that I'm looking at right now is that, first of all, so we just had some hail issues. We had a bunch of guys that were right at that point where they're ready to go, pull the trigger, yes, maybe, no. Do we need to start spraying for some weevils in some areas? And then, okay, now that we've had this event, I don't want anybody to think that the hail event took care of the weevil problem, first of all. It's like somebody telling me, well, I went and cut my hay and I used a conditioner with rollers in it, I killed all the weevils. Now, folks, that's not true. You might have knocked them down to the ground, but those weevils are still there. They can climb right back up that little plant and start chewing again. So I think there's a lot of neat things that we have an opportunity to do, and that would be, hey, we've talked a lot about putting a fungicide on a crop in that 6-inch stage of growth to try to protect it from bacterial leaf spot, other diseases, and all this other stuff. Oh, and by the way, we need to take care of some insect pressures. And we just had cold rain on dirt that was starting to warm up, but how active are the nutrients in that soil and the micros? And we need that plant to be strong and take off. So I'm sitting here thinking to myself, I do want the fungicide because I want the extra plant protection for that first growth. I want the extra plant protection to help it reduce the stress that it just went through. I'd love to have some micronutrients in there because I know that the soil deeper is still cool and we need to get that micronutrient activity going. Maybe there's a plant growth regulator that help us get caught up if we slowed that plant down a little bit. So I just want to throw that out there and say, guys, we've put together some tremendous programs to help people intensively manage alfalfa. And even at a hail event situation where we still have some plant material out there. And I want to just focus right now on that shorter plant, and then we'll get a little bit deeper conversation into something that's a little taller because Randy, I think you alluded on that. Do you go try to clip things or not? And the fact that this alfalfa plant being shorter, even if it did get damaged a little bit, my personal thoughts up front is you just squint, look at it with one eye and go, okay, what can we do to salvage what's left? Because I'm not burning diesel fuel to go clip off something 6 inches tall, knowing well that more buds are coming. Even if it broke that top trifoliate off, there's another bud on the side of that stem that's 6 or 8 inches tall that will take off and kind of regrow around it and keep going. So I want to hear your thoughts on fungicide, micros, plant growth regulator, insecticide at this point. I think I answered the question, but I want your opinion.
So, Jeff, one of the things you alluded to, and Mark did too, is, we don't want to have additional stress. So this plant has went through stress. We want to do what we can. Mark talked about the new genetics, and there's some fantastic things that went on with genetics. It's also changed our management a little bit too. A lot of guys have switched to a longer period in between cutting with some of these new genetics. And so it's even more important we get some fungicides out there and protect that. There's not a lot of good research on hail damage to any crops out there. It's hard to do research at a university. Way back 20, 30 years ago, University of Nebraska actually had a hail machine where they'd go out and put bagged ice in there and they'd blow it on the plants and able to do some research. And, they used to have some hail schools there, and I attended a couple of those and helped teach one of those. But it was kind of interesting because you can go out there and you can simulate hail damage, but it never looks the same as hail damage. So we don't have a lot of data on recovery. I do think having a good fungicide program helps not only with that recovery of what we have out there, but also of those next cuttings. Mark said that, it's about how do we set that plant up so it isn't stressed, so we can get good recovery. Obviously, controlling weevils and insects kind of table stakes. You can't have the tonnage and good quality alfalfa if you've got things out there eating all the good parts of that alfalfa. And most people know I'm big on fertility. I think that we leave a lot on the table when we don't have the right nutrients out there. So yes. I think there's a lot of things we can do. And again, if we're want to have as much protection as we can of that alfalfa crop, it pays to get out there and get active and do something to help that plant survive.
Those are all great points, Randy. And you mentioned that we don't have a lot of good data out there, and we don't, but what we do have is some pretty good research that shows that if we do certain things within the plant, we can get some responses out there. And, there's an area that's kind of new, but yet not new, that we hear a lot about it's this biostimulant, biologicals, and PGR market. And we hear it more on some more of our broadacre crops of corn and soybeans, but we've actually within Winfield and with this little group here looked at utilizing one of our products called Ascend for plant recovery from hail. And, there's some good researchers out there that, just for some of us that Ascend might be new or not as common, this is a plant growth regulator that utilizes 3 different PGRs with gibberellic acid, cytokinin, and IBA for an auxin. And so what's unique and great about that is we're kind of covering the 3 of the 5 main growth hormones that we know a lot about within the plant. And so when we come to a stressful condition where we have hail impact and so forth there could be some injury that was done to that plant. So like to the vascular tissue, there could be some things that we can do in IBA. So the auxins have shown to help out with vascular tissue recovery. So when we get a product that could utilize that and we could see that put on, we can help with that recovery within that vascular tissue. We can also help out with the IBA with increasing active root participation. So you talked about being cold and wet there, Jeff. They might not be new roots in there, but we can get them active, and that can help out when we have cooler conditions there. So Another thing is with the cytokinin in there with the Ascend, that helps out with promoting new shoot growth and cell proliferation. So that drives that.
Yeah.
Ultimately, we use all these big words, but ultimately around cell division. So
Right.
what's the cell going to do? So the more division we have, the more activity we can have. So that helps also. And then cytokinins also helped out with, like we see with like fungicide, delaying that leaf senescence. So it's all about leaf retention on our alfalfa for quality as well as tons. I know I'm a cow-calf guy myself. I always also hear a lot of people say, well, I don't need that good quality of hay, but I like the tons. Well, we get a lot more tons when I get more leaves rolled up in that bale. So if I can keep that leaf retention, that's huge. And then, GA, I mentioned having gibberellic acid in there. That also stimulates growth when where plants are under abiotic stresses. So they all work in conjunction in parts of that plant. So though we don't have a lot of data on there, we've seen a lot of value with recovery with this Ascend product. So that would be something that someone could utilize in this alfalfa that got injured in that 4-inch to 6-inch level, where we got a lot of growth left yet on that plant before we go out there and cut. So
Yeah,
those
absolutely.
are just some different things we've seen out there, Jeff.
So let's take that story to the next level and say that you're okay. So we have a counterpart down in Oklahoma, Mr. John Stotts. I know that he actually cut an alfalfa stand last week and got some baled up already. So he's in Oklahoma City area. So he's literally got one cutting on one field done and was going to do some more this week. So a guy like that had, or myself, where I've got 18 inches of growth today, and we come in and we get stripped up pretty good. I've probably got two. So let's take John back out of the equation, because he's at that point where he's going to cut what's there right now because he doesn't have enough pre-harvest interval for any more active ingredient. I've got 2.5 weeks before I'm going to take mine. So let's say I got stripped up a little bit. I didn't have anything on ahead of time. I was not the high intensive management person before, so I didn't do anything. I was just going to let it go. But I got stripped up pretty good today. Not to the point where I'm going to go harvest it and to get it to restart, but I've got some damage. So let's just leave it that way. I think there's two things. You could get hit so bad that it's almost pounded back to the ground, and you can maybe just go flail mow it or bush hog it off to make yourself feel better, or you can take what's there yet and try to limp it for the next 2.5 weeks. So again, some of these components that we just talked about, how do you guys feel that we would find activity on doing some of those management pieces yet at this point with 2.5 to 3 weeks left?
So a couple things that come to mind when you lay that scenario out, Jeff, is that first of all, how much leaf area do I have out there? So with all these products, we got to have enough leaf area to get them into the plant and recover.
Yep.
One of the things, if you're 2.5 weeks until harvest, one of the things I would be out and scouting those fields and looking for my regrowth at the bottom of that plant. And I would make sure that I was managing for that regrowth, because what you don't want to do is wait and let that other recover and then have that regrowth come up and you're clipping off your second cutting along with your first. So I kind of look at that. I think that with that 2.5 weeks, you're kind of, in my opinion, right on the border of some of these treatments, because it takes a little bit of time. If you're 3 weeks out, I think, yeah, going out and trying to do something to stimulate that plant's probably a good idea. But I would let that plant really tell me what my next step is and what's happening with that regrowth underneath that.
So we're going to pause. So we're going to pause for a few days, is what you just basically said. We're going to push the pause button, go work some cows, go do some other crop inputs, and then we're going to come back in 5 days to see what that plant tells us. Is it going to regrow from the base? When those primary buds get broke off, that plant has a trigger that says, okay, just got harvested, it's time to regrow again, right? Anytime we cut that thing, you're going to maybe see some of those issues. So yes, that new growth from the buds at the base of this plant could be taken off, and you might risk clipping those. So you might have to take kind of a dirty first cutting, but let it go longer.
Allowing that plant to tell us what it looks like. I'm with Randy. It's a little easier decision when in the event like this happens earlier on in the growth. But when we get into that mid-season to late season, a lot of it also determines what type of management or manager we've been to this alfalfa crop.
Sure.
will help us understand how that potentially can recover too. But ultimately, the crop will show us how it's recovering, and there's not anything better than letting a little bit of time out there. Let us see if we need to come in and support that with something else.
So we did have an example here a couple years ago where we had a stand that was, about halfway through that growing period. And I don't remember off the top of my head right now if it was first cutting, second cutting, but it was earlier in the year where we had a hail event. And the decision was made to let it sit for 5 days, get some new trifoliates to open up, see what that growth was going to look like. And we had enough season left that we could do that rate and have our 14-day pre-harvest interval out there on some fungicide and some micros. So just a little testimonial that we did try this here a couple years ago. That field was split. Nice operation. So we had a dairy with a scale right at the end of the field, basically, right? So it worked out pretty good where you could go scale some loads. And the recovery where we did the treatment on those damaged plants, it ended up being somewhere in the neighborhood of a $75 an acre return because of the extra recovery versus no treatment on that alfalfa plant to go out with a fungicide, and I believe there's a little micronutrient package in there and some insecticide to keep the bugs out at that point. So we've seen some of those things happen on a first-hand basis, and I think that's just good to remember that we do have tools in the toolbox.
You had also mentioned, we may have to take a dirty crop, that first one, leave some of that old tissue out there. One of the things, if you're going to do that, that now becomes a high scouting field for me, because you've got a place for a lot of insects, you've got a place for a lot of diseases, whatnot to harbor in there. So I think management in that situation where, you don't have enough recovery that you're going to take it as a crop, so you're going to leave it, and then all of a sudden you got that new growth. That becomes a high management field, in my opinion. And I think those fungicide, insecticides, and potentially an Ascend type product on there to get some regrowth, make sure that second cut is really pretty vigorous. I think that becomes more important.
I'm going to be the wise guy that says every damn alfalfa field's a high management situation, and if you're not managing it that way, shame on you.
Yeah, but it may be one of those things rather than, every 10 to 14 days scouting. You may need to tighten it up on this one because you are in a unique situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that crop is actually trying to grow at a late first cutting into a early second cutting. So
it is.
You got a lot of growth patterns that are unique within that situation.
Okay, so now let's go to another scenario and say at the Jackson Ranch, we went out and we were 6 inches tall. A couple weeks ago, we applied fungicide, micronutrients, and we put the whole kitchen sink out there. We had ZMB Plus, Boron, Everlon fungicide, Ascend, SL, Voya Grow, the whole ball of wax, and we got dinged a little bit. Did I do myself a favor for some recovery by having all that out there to begin with? I mean, I was after high yield to begin with, but just for anybody out there, did that help me probably get through this first cutting and a little benefit on second cut?
I think Mark said it before, not only are we managing that first cutting, it's that second, third, potentially cutting out there. And anything we do to have that crop in a better situation to recover and grow normally is going to be in our benefit.
That was just a pat on my back. I wanted you to tell me I did a good job. Attaboy, Jeff. Thank you. You took care of it ahead of time.
Well, it is frustrating. So when you
Yes.
get that mindset of trying to be more aggressive in your management as well as to push that alfalfa crop, and you throw that type of investment out, and then you do have a weather event come through like that, we do realize that we might have reduced some of that response in that cutting though. And I think that's probably plausible. Important for us to understand is we've got at least 3 more cracks at it in a normal growing season with alfalfa.
Yep.
And so what we can confidently say is we're probably helped ourselves out for that plant to recover to help us with that second and third and in our fourth cutting there throughout the growing season. So it's not a waste by any means, but actually we see a favorable recovery pretty well in that situation versus where if it wasn't even on. So I think it was valuable. Not to pat yourself on the back there, Jeff, but we understand that higher management does respond quicker than lower management.
I think the other thing that we need to do an honest assessment is what was our tonnage originally on that field? Mark and I are from irrigation country up here in Nebraska, and we managed 300 bushel corn a lot different than we manage 200 bushel corn. And so it's kind of the same way with alfalfa. We've got got the right genetics out there. We got a high producing field. That management is really, that plant is really responsive to management. If we've got some thinned out stands, maybe some poorer soil, if the tonnage isn't there, we just manage that a lot.
Made me think of another point for people to consider, and you both have probably touched on it just to a degree. Anytime I see an alfalfa event that happens, whether it's hard frost, hail, severe drought, some of those pieces, the older stands and the older stands that were managed with less effort, is how I'm going to say it at this point, are probably going to be the worst recovery and the more plant reduction morbidity rate, or we're going to lose more, period. The older the stand, maybe the cheaper the genetics, maybe the less management that we've put to that field, that plant's just going to be weaker. It's not going to handle the stress as well. And that goes again with frost. I have seen newly seeded alfalfa on one side of the fence with cotyledons out of the ground, and alfalfa on the other side that was 8 inches tall at the same time, and have a frost come through. The new seeded alfalfa stand that's germinating took it without any hesitation, and the stuff that was 8 inches tall melted back and lost 30% of the plants because it was an old, poor managed stand right next door. Or first year stands. I was just in Kansas this week looking at this would be the second year on an alfalfa stand, and how beautiful and resilient it looked versus a 6 or 7 year old 7-year-old wore out stand next to it, literally pivot to pivot, the resilience of a newer plant versus an old plant that has just been run through the ringer. So keep that in mind as you're trying to decide how to manage some of these acres. Which ones do I need to focus on first? Do I need to your point in the first couple comments, Randy, did I take some really bad crown damage even with big hail? Dig some plants, do the whole read the stand scenario and assess the crown damage. Did we really? I've heard of people talking about large hail that literally bruised the alfalfa crowns, and we had poor bud development. So lots to consider, folks. But I think that's just a good conversation we needed to have, because I don't know that I've ever seen anybody put out information or have a conversation like this where we talked about hail and hail assessment and what we can do or things to consider. But I think the thing that I hadn't thought of, Randy, and thanks for bringing it up until you said it, was secondary regrowth underneath. Because if you get crazy and you go out there and do some things with a cutter and you're taking that secondary regrowth off at a really weird premature immature stage, now you've got two poor cuttings at the same time, instead of letting that growth come back through and or manage those buds underneath. That's a good point.
And I think your point about that is different with genetics out there.
Yeah.
Is something to really keep in mind too, that just don't look at one of your fields. If you've got different genetics out there, make sure you get in each of those fields and walk them and just really see where you're at with regrowth.
Nope, absolutely. So you have genetics, age of the stand, how it's been managed, all those things tie into it. So with that being said, gentlemen, I think we covered a lot of neat little hot button topics and points there. Anything else that
I just have one comment in
Yeah.
general. This is kind of with any crops. Crops can usually handle one or two stresses and do okay. It's when we have multiple stresses out there that we really start doing some detrimental things. So if we get some hail damage, then we have diseases come in, or if we're not looking at insect damage out there, it's just going to compound the effect that stand has. And to Mark's point, not going to just affect this crop, this cutting, it's going to affect all of them if we can't get that plant to recover.
And I would also encourage, I think one of the resounding thing that you heard a lot of us mention is be observational, be an observational agronomist, whether you're an agronomist that's local or if you're a farmer, you're still an agronomist. So get out in those fields, and we don't want to see these events happen, but what they can do is allow us to first understand how can plants take this type of injury, and potentially how can we manage if that situation happens again. It just seems like there's more occurrence of this happening in bigger geographies or more intense as well. But I think what is important for us to understand is we are putting newer genetics in the ground as we're managing more with our alfalfa fields. It's important for us to go out there and just see how they respond out there. And then if we do some action, see how the plant recovers even additionally to where we didn't, if we have a check strip out there. But most of us, if we're aggressive, we don't want to potentially lose out either, right? So there's value in it, even if we treated the whole field, to just go out there and see how it responded. And you can see some differences out there. So I just encourage you. I know it's frustrating and it's also hard on us emotionally to go out there when these things happen, but it's allowing us to see and learn potentially how we can manage things maybe differently or even more aggressively if we have that opportunity in front of us.
One more thing, we've opened that canopy up fairly early in some of these, and that regrowth may be coming on later. Don't forget about your weeds.
Yeah.
We may start to see as we open that canopy up, we may need to go out with some weed control.
That's a great point. So weed control will absolutely, and almost, guys, it seems inherently in my mind over the years of scouting alfalfa, is that when you go out into an alfalfa field, and I'm going to go back to like aphids particularly, it seems like the highest aphid pressure is usually on the stressed part of the field. The bugs, for some reason, it's like there's a different sugar level or something in an alfalfa plant that's going under stress or a little bit damaged for some reason. We seem to see the insect pressure is just more noticeable, maybe because maybe the plant's shorter stressed, higher concentration per leaf area, whatever that might be. But weirdly enough, it seems like damaged or stressed alfalfa seems to have more bug pressure than the really good, healthy, lush, vigorous growth. And maybe that's a cause and effect relationship to some degree as well, but that's something, the bugs that seem to always go out there. I think one thing I want to clear up too is that we had a very good discussion about what to look for. What are some of the things to consider? Everybody that watches this, you have to understand, we're not going to give you a prescription and a silver bullet answer to lay it on the table. You still have to go out there, use some judgment, use some discretion, take your gut feel, because I know we just are putting this together, and I'm going to have 5,000 phone calls following the publication of this asking, well, what should I do? We just kind of laid out some stuff for you all to make that decision, right? I didn't say don't call me, but I'm saying I'm going to give you the same speech I just did if you call me. Anything else for parting words, gentlemen?
Well, I would also encourage, we got to understand too, if we predominantly take that hay off in a bale or something. So what we do at the midterm as well, if we have a lot of insect pressure, is will affect what that windrow does when it's laying there drying. So we've all seen that. If we got heavy insect pressure, how it affects when we drop it down in that windrow, that regrowth underneath it. So one thing that usually happens is if we have this weather patterns going on, we drop that hay down on that windrow and it tends to rain a little bit. That also puts more pressure underneath that regrowth, underneath that windrow. So I do encourage maybe to manage that. If we have a lot of insects, manage that before it drops down so we don't impact that recovery underneath that windrow. See that a lot of times out in the country. I don't know what you've seen, Randy or Jeff, as you travel, but that's one thing I would make sure we're thinking about as well.
Yeah, no, we just created a nice environment for them to live under and start working on our second cutting. So great point, Mark.
Absolutely. Well, gentlemen, thank you for your time today. Hope everybody takes some from this, and let us know if you have any questions. So from the Forage Fanatic and the gentleman here at Winfield, y'all have a great day.